Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It means an awful lot, and I appreciate you being here for this presentation about this most special subject. A little bit about me. Let me introduce myself for anyone that I don't know. My name is Dave Babitz. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I was born and raised in suburban Chicago, actually in Glenview. I'm a husband and father of two. That's my family there. Been a parishioner here at St. Mary's for 11 years, and a proud member of the Knights of Columbus Council here, and also a longtime serving Scoutmaster, just stepped down last year. So really, I'm one of you. Let me tell you a little more about how I wound up here today. My story for the Shroud, my interest in it, really begins in two places. One, when I was a little child in the early 1970s, I can remember on Holy Saturday, a real grainy black and white presentation on Holy Saturday morning by a priest, I don't know who it was, on public television, talking about this cloth, and just really kind of sparked my interest. And then from there, really, the story goes to 1982, to a theater in suburban Chicago, Illinois, where I sat down, and when the film opened, I saw that Paramount logo, and it did the best dissolve I've ever seen into this mountain, and I was mesmerized. And into the screen walks the man with the whip and the hat. And it was the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I was hooked. I was convinced that this is what I wanted to do. And so a few short years later, I ended up in college out in Colorado, and I found an Introduction to Archaeology class. I thought, this is fantastic. Here I go. And so I joined the class, and on day one, I walk in, and the instructor says, before we do anything, I just want to remind you or show you that the name of this class is Introduction to Archaeology. It is not Raiders of the Lost Ark. And my name is Professor whatever his name was. It's not Indiana Jones. And it was crushed. I was crushed. And so I ended up not pursuing a career in archaeology, but I do believe everything happens for a reason, because had that not happened the way it did, I know for sure that I wouldn't be here today, which means that you wouldn't be here today. So everything happens for a reason, and I believe the right folks are in this room tonight. One other thing about me and my faith in particular is I've had struggles for a lot of times and really had a doubting Thomas attitude towards things. I needed to see proof. We're all familiar with the story of doubting Thomas. And I'm going to ask tonight, our topic, many people have some familiarity with it. Maybe have heard some information, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. For the rest of our time together today, what I want you to do is adopt a doubting Thomas mindset. Kind of clear your mind of what we know, and let's look at evidence, let's look at things to see what we can prove to ourselves about the Shroud. We're going to take a journey together. And we're going to cover a few things. We're going to look at it from history to see what history can tell us about the Shroud. Also, a little look at art and iconography and how the Shroud has influenced that. And then, of course, talk about the science and the technology around it. So let's start with our journey in history. Now, to start this, we're going to start right here, but just back a little bit in time to December 2020. There is an exposition of the Shroud. We're going to travel all the way from here across the Atlantic Ocean over to Europe, and specifically all the way across Europe to the northern part of Italy to Turin. And in Turin, specifically, we're going to go to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. When we enter the cathedral, we're confronted with a cloth. This cloth is about 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and it bears the image front and back, unclothed, of a man, as well as what looks like some damage to it. So let's take a look at it in a little more detail. Specifically, the image of the man. We see a very clear face with long hair. We see a long nose. We see the hands crossed left over right, and we see a blood wound on what appears to be a blood wound on the wrist. We notice the absence of any thumbs in the hands. We also have a large stain of what appears to be blood near the side. All across the body, specifically all across the back, we see what appears to be stripe marks, possibly blood. And then at both ends of the cloth, at the what would be the feet of the front and back side of the image, we see another concentration of blood at the feet. We also notice these damage marks. So there's a series of patterns that look to be burn holes. And we see a matching pattern of triangles here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then another pattern of an L-shaped burn holes that there are 4. And then a pair in the center. If we get a close-up look at the cloth, we see it has what's called a herringbone weave to it. So, unusual weave to this cloth. Let's look at the face a little bit more. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to a gentleman named Paul Vignon, who did a study of the shroud in the early 20th century. He was a French professor of biology, and he was an artist. And he identified 20 unique features on the face of the shroud. Let's take a look at them. We've boiled down to scientists' sense then to about 15. We won't necessarily cover all of them, but let's look at a couple in particular that we're going to notice. We see a very long nose, very long, thin nose. We see particularly the left eye as we look at it is, as the person's left eye seems larger, as well as the cheek is deeply bruised here. We see a forked beard, also bruising under the other eye, and some other identifying features there. This line across here is actually a crease in the cloth. So we'll refer back to these. One other one I want to point out, actually. You see right here at the bridge of the nose, there's a square-shaped pattern, an open square-shaped pattern that also comes into play. So, we find this cloth in Turin, we ask ourselves, well, how did it get here? And that's a great question. So let's look a little bit at the cathedral itself. The Cathedral of St. John the Baptist was built in Turin on the location of an ancient Roman theater, which was originally, there were 3 churches there. And the timeline on this is that in 613 AD, they tore down the 3 churches. They finished the 3 churches in 613 AD. That's what you see here as an excavation outside of the cathedral of the original churches. Then in 1498, they tore down those churches and they built the Basilica of St. John, that's the completed basilica there. And then in 1694, they built what's called the Guarini Chapel. The Guarini Chapel, the Cathedral of St. John, is actually built onto the Palace of Savoy in Turin, and the Guarini Chapel sits between the palace and the cathedral. So it's attached and it's specifically built to house the shroud. It took 28 years to build that, and what you see here is what the Guarini Chapel looks like. Inside there is a box at the top of the altar that is bulletproof, that's fireproof, it's everything proof, and inside a case in that box is where the shroud is housed when it's not being displayed. So how did it get to Turin? Well, that story happens in 1578. Cardinal Charles Borromeo, yes, that Charles Borromeo, St. Charles Borromeo, is the Cardinal of Milan, Italy. And at that time, Milan had recently survived a bout with the bubonic plague. And so Charles Borromeo plans a trip on foot to the town of Chambéry, France, where it's known that there is a cloth that is purported to bear the image of our Savior on it, and he wants to make a pilgrimage to venerate it. That path is about 200 miles on foot. Quite a distance. At the time, Duke Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy, who is in Turin, and the Savoy family owns the shroud at this point, and it's in Chambéry. Well, he doesn't want to have the cardinal have to make that journey, so he arranges to have the shroud brought from Chambéry to Turin so that the cardinal can make a much shorter journey and venerate the shroud, which he does. And at that time, in 1578, is when the shroud is enshrined in Turin, where it's been to this day. So we have to ask ourselves, all right, fine, it came from Chambry. How did it get to Chambry? Let's take a look. At the Sainte-Chapelle of the House of the Dukes of Savoy. I will not try to pronounce all of that in French. So how did it get to Chambry? Well, in 1502, a woman named Marguerite of Austria, she was the Duchess of Savoy. At this time, the Savoy family had the shroud. They had been traveling with the shroud, and she arranged for a permanent home to be made for the shroud in Chambry Castle. It was enshrined there in a real elaborate ceremony that was officiated by the Archbishop of Grenoble. Hundreds in attendance, so this is well documented. At that time, it's encased in an ornate a solid silver box, and housed in a wall niche behind the high altar and behind an iron gate sealed with 4 locks. And to protect the shroud, and so nothing happens to it, those 4 locks, the keys for them, 2 of them are given to the Duke of Savoy, and 2 are given to clergy. So we have a dispersal of the keys for those locks, which is all well and good until 1532. In 1532, there's a large fire in Sainte-Chapelle. The shroud is threatened. In a panic, the clergy bring in blacksmiths to break open the locks, which takes a little bit of time. By the time they get it out, the silver box has largely melted. And one drip of molten silver inside the box fell on the shroud, and that was the cause of the folded shroud, and that was the cause of these burn marks. So these triangular marks on the shroud, or these triangular holes, of which there are 8, came from the shroud being folded up in the case, the molten silver dripped on it, burned one corner, and then when we unfold it, that's how we have those marks. Now, from there, 2 years later, the Poor Clare nuns, who were commissioned by Marguerite specifically to take care of the shroud, they perform repairs on the shroud. They repair it and they reinforce it. They sew a backing cloth on the shroud. They repair the burn holes, and those cloths have stayed attached to the shroud ever since then. And so it sits in the cathedral in Chambry until 1578, as we discussed, which is when the Duke brings the shroud to Turin. So that's really its life in Chambry. So then we ask ourselves, well, how did it get to Chambry? We have to trace further back. So way up north on the map here, you'll see what you may be able to read as Troyes, T-R-O-Y-E-S. And very close to that, there's a little commune up to this day called Lorey, France. And our story takes us to Lorey, France, to the Church of St. Mary. Now in Lorey, the shroud makes its first appearance in the year 1353. A very pious knight named Geoffrey de Charnay founds what's called the Chapel of the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin, which is now St. Mary. What you see here is the chapel. This is actually the 3rd building built on this site. So the original chapel built by Sir Geoffrey was wood. They took that down, built a second one, they took that down. This is now the current one. And so he, in the charter for the founding of the chapel, he talks about possessing several relics which will be displayed at the chapel when he's asking for permission to build the chapel, and the shroud is listed among them. Now, he doesn't say, it's not really clear where he comes into possession of the shroud. We do know it's there, we do know it came from him, but we don't really know where he got it. He had some stories which people aren't really sure of, but we do know it's there. And it begins being displayed in 1355, and there are continuous displays all along. And they describe elaborate ceremonies to display the shroud, where they have 2 priests lift the shroud up and bring it up on top of a high platform for all to see in a very elaborate ceremony. And what we see here are some medallions, pilgrim medallions, because people are making pilgrimages to Lorey at this time, which brings actually financial benefit to the chapel itself. This badge right here is the earliest known pilgrim badge of Lorey. Shows the shroud, shows 2 priests holding the shroud, and the reason that we know it's from there is because on the bottom here you see 2 coats of arms, This one is the Descharnay family crest, and this is the crest of Descharnay's wife. So we know it's from that. That was found in the mud under a bridge in Paris in the River Seine in the 1850s. The other image here is a sketch of a mold of another pilgrim badge that was found in a town right next to Lirey in the 20th century, or the early 21st century, and that's what the badge would look like that was made from that. Interesting, very, very similar. One difference is that the coats of arms are flipped. So Descharnay's wife's coat of arms is on the left now, or what's kind of in the superior position, and then Descharnay's coat of arms is on the right. So the thinking here is that may have been struck after Descharnay dies, because the cathedral was built in 1353. By 1356, Descharnay is killed at the Battle of Poitiers. So his wife then petitions to have all of the lands put in her son's name, keeping possession of the shroud in the Descharnay family. And the displays go on until the year 1389. Now, Pierre d'Arcy is the Archbishop of nearby Troyes, as we mentioned. And there's concerns at the time about the folks in Lirey portraying this as a true burial cloth of Christ, and there's a lot of scandal around that. And as well, we can imagine, probably not as good for the Archdiocese or the Diocese of Troyes to have all of the pilgrimage income going to nearby Lirey and not to Troyes. So Pierre d'Arcy then appeals to Pope Clement VI, asking him to stop displays of the shroud, denouncing it. In his denunciations, he mentions that he accuses the Descharnay family of commissioning a forger to create this as a false artifact. That claim, that document, is something that folks that are opponents of the authenticity of the shroud still try to cite. We can obviously see there might be a lot of human reasons why he would be motivated to speak out against the shroud. Regardless, Pope Clement sides with the Descharnay family, and not only does he threaten Pierre d'Arcy with excommunication if he doesn't lay off of the Lirey Chapel, he actually starts to grant indulgences for pilgrims to go to Lirey to venerate the shroud. And this is a document of one of the indulgences granted by Pope Clement. So on it goes in Lirey until the year 1418. So we get to a point now where Marguerite Descharnay, who is Geoffroy Descharnay's granddaughter, there's marauding bands in the area, and there becomes concern for this tiny little Lirey chapel and the security of the relics in the chapel, including the shroud. And so it's removed from the Lirey castle, or the St. Mary's in Lirey, and travels with Marguerite around Europe. And there's concerns, and there's some scandal about that. She's threatened with excommunication as well. Along the way, she ends up in Lyon, France, in a castle and grounds granted to her by Duke Louis I of Savoy, who is her cousin's husband. And it's granted for services rendered, which we assume is displays of the shroud. So in 1460, Marguerite Descharnay dies, and she wills the shroud to the Savoy family. This is how the Savoy family becomes in possession of the shroud. In 1464, this is documented in the Paris Accord by Duke Louis of Savoy. He documents that the Lirey Chapel is owed compensation for the removal of the shroud from Lirey, because the priests there are still asking for it back. He also documents in there, records the transfer of the shroud to the Savoys by Margaret. So we have that transfer of ownership documented, as well as he acknowledges in that document that the shroud was given to the Lirey Chapel by Geoffroy Descharnay. So we have documentation of that. Then in 1502, as this has been traveling around, eventually this is where the Duchess of Savoy enshrines it, says this has to have a permanent home, which is how it ended up in Chambry. So, how did it then get to, same question, how did it get to Lirey? Well, to start to answer that question, we end up in a dotted line here, because we're going to the Middle East, and we're starting to get into the realm of speculation here a little bit. There's some things that we know for sure, and some things that we don't. We end up in Constantinople. It's known that the shroud has been in Constantinople. It arrives there because the Byzantine Emperor Romanus Lecapenus in 944 AD, he's in Constantinople. This is the Byzantine Empire. He's trying to expand his empires to the east in Asia Minor, and he lays siege to the city of Edessa in 944 AD. Edessa is in possession of an artifact or relic called the Image of Edessa, or the Mandylion. And this is purported to be an image of the face of Christ, just the face, that has been venerated in Edessa for a long time. So during the siege, as part of ransom for raising the siege, he secures the Mandylion in payment of that. So he brings the Mandylion, or the Image of Edessa, to Constantinople. He enshrines it in the Church of the Virgin of Pharos, and there are many documented displays of the shroud in Constantinople from 944 on for quite a while, till 1204. What happens in 1204? The Fourth Crusade is on their way to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. And because of various reasons, they divert to Constantinople. At this time, you have battles between the Latin Church in Rome and the Eastern Church in Constantinople. And so they sack Constantinople, the Crusaders do, in 1204. At that point, the shroud disappears from record in Constantinople. So we know it's there from 944 to 1204. We don't know what happened to it definitively documented after 1204, but we do know that it disappears from the record. Now, a little bit more about the documentation of the shroud in Constantinople. Like I said, is well documented. There's plenty of examples here of talking about it, but there's a couple that I want to highlight. In 1095, there's a letter by a man named Alexius Comnenus, who is a leader in Constantinople, writing to his friend Robert the Frisian, Count of the Flemings. And he describes that the Turks are invading the areas around Constantinople and are soon going to take the capital. And he prefers that the capital be taken by Western Christian knights rather than by the Turks. And so in his letter he writes, he wishes this because, quote, the city houses great treasures as well as the precious relics of the Lord. And then he names the relics, and he says they include, and this is unequivocally for the first time documented, quote, the linen cloths found in the sepulchre after his resurrection. So this is the first time in documentation that the shroud in Constantinople is referred to as the linen cloths found in the sepulchre. Then in 1203, as the Fourth Crusade is underway, Robert de Clary is a knight in the crusade. He keeps a journal, and he talks about the siege of Constantinople and the sacking of it. And he says there was another of the churches, which they called My Lady Saint Mary of Blachernae, where was kept the sindones in which our Lord had been wrapped, which stood up straight every Friday, so that the features of our Lord could be plainly seen there. And no one, either the Greek or the French, ever knew what became of this sindone after the city was taken. Every Friday it was stood upright so that the features of our Lord could be plainly seen. This certainly seems to indicate that we're now talking about an image of just the face of our Lord, but potentially the entire image of our Lord, possibly the shroud. Then in 1205, Theodore Angelus's letter to Pope Innocent III, he's writing to the Pope, and in the letter he talks about the sack of Constantinople. And he says, in April of last year, a crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste to the city of Constantine. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. The Venetians partitioned the treasures of gold, silver, and ivory, while the French did the same with the relics of the saints, and the most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. We know that the sacred objects are preserved by their predators in Venice, in France, and in other places, the sacred linen in Athens, unquote. So Angelus's letter to the Pope clearly states that not only did the Crusaders make off with the shroud, but potentially the French Crusaders did. Now stay with me on this one, because this takes us to, as soon as we start talking about the Knights Templar, everybody kind of goes, okay, now we're into fairyland. Knights Templar did exist, and we have to ask, is there a connection from Constantinople in the Knights Templar? Now, a little bit about the Knights Templar. They were founded in 1119 to protect religious artifacts and holy sites during the Crusades. And we know that they were at the sack of Constantinople in 1204. In 2009, a Vatican researcher by the name of Barbara Fraley is doing some research, and she discovers an ancient document called the Shinnon Parchment. And it was miscatalogued in the Vatican archives, so it was lost to history for potentially hundreds of years. And she finds it, and what it is it's recording of the trials of the Knights Templar, because the Knights Templar were outlawed in the Middle Ages, and we'll get into that in a second, but the trials, the recording of the trials is in the Shinnon Parchment. And specifically, we hone in on the testimony of a gentleman named Arnaud Sabatier. So he was inducted into the order in 1287, and this is what the document says. In part, I was taken to a secret place to which only the brothers of the temple had access. There I was shown a long linen cloth on which was impressed the figure of a man, and instructed to venerate the image by kissing its feet 3 times. This was part of the Knights Templar initiation ceremony, and it certainly sounds like it could be the shroud. Now in 1312, this is when Pope Clement dissolves the order, and he cites, among other reasons, the illegal possession of relics and idolatrous worship of Jesus. Because we have to realize, when the Crusades were going on, there were specific rules against possession of religious relics. And so if you were in possession of something, you had to be very careful, because you could be dealt with excommunication or worse. Now there were some of the Knights Templar who did not adhere to Pope Clement's order and continued to practice, and they suffered for it. 2 years later, in 1314, 2 Templar Grand Masters, we know, were burned at the stake in Paris. One of those was a knight named Geoffrey de Charnay of Normandy, who happens to be the uncle of Geoffrey de Charnay, who founded the chapel in Lire, France in 1353. So, we have to ask ourselves, where did Geoffrey de Charnay come into possession of the shroud? Could it be that it was from his uncle, who was one of the Grand Masters, who potentially was in on the sack of Constantinople? We don't know. It's speculation. Especially with the 2009 document location, though, there are some strong suggestions. But let's go back to our journey. In Constantinople, now we have to travel. We talked about the siege of Edessa, so let's go to Edessa and say, well, how did this artifact, or this icon, arrive in Edessa? So let's talk a little bit about the image of Edessa. Now this is really where it kind of gets into legend. There's a story about King Abgar of Edessa, who ruled from 13 AD to 50 AD. We know he suffered from an illness. They think it was leprosy. There's some chronic illness. And the story is that he hears about Jesus performing miracles in the Holy Land, and he sends an envoy of his court to ask Jesus, with some written correspondence, to come and to see him and to heal him. Now, basically the way the story goes, Jesus said, sorry, a little busy right now, I can't come up and see you, but I will send somebody to you. And after Jesus' death, the Apostle Thaddeus arrives, and again, there's several different accounts, but among those is an account that he arrived with a cloth containing an image of Jesus' face that is referred to as folded tetradiplon, or 4-doubled, or doubled in 4 folding. We do know that the legend says at that point that Abgar is healed, and he declares Christianity throughout Edessa as the religion of Edessa. Now, after Abgar passes away, his son Manu reverts back to paganism, and Christianity is now outlawed. So now we flip back, and at that point the records of the image of Edessa disappear. It's assumed it's destroyed. We don't know, but all kinds of records, and we can understand why, if Christianity is outlawed, any of those images disappear. It reemerges somewhere in the 500s. Now there's a few stories here about the reemergence. In 525, Edessa was flooded, and it's recorded that when they were repairing from the flood, above the western gate of the city, that there was a folded cloth with the facial features of a man found hidden inside a wall niche above the west gate. This could be the image of Edessa. In 544, the Persians lay siege to Edessa, and there's several stories about the image of Edessa being involved with the miraculous repelling of the Persians from that assault. Then in 593, a gentleman named Evagrius Scholasticus, he was a Syrian scholar, he wrote a long work called Ecclesiastical History. And the reason we point this out is that within that is he uses the term to describe the image of Edessa as akira-pota. Translated, it's an image not made by human hands. So this becomes the first time in history that we see something like the image of Edessa or the shroud as potentially not made by human hands. Then in 944, the Byzantines, as we mentioned before, lay siege to Edessa, and the image of Edessa, the Mandylion, travels to Constantinople as ransom. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of tetradiplon, or doubled in four. Because the speculation is, or the question is, was the image of Edessa potentially the shroud, but folded up? Because it's been recorded the image of Edessa was encased in basically a frame, a cloth frame. And the question is, could it have stayed folded up that long so that you only see a face? If you take the shroud and you fold it in half, there's fold number one. And then you take it and you fold 3 more times, you end up with this image, which only shows the face. Now what's interesting is not just it's a way to fold the shroud to show the face of the figure on the shroud, but all the images of Edessa that we see are all in landscape like this. They're all wide, and they have the face in the center. And let's remember too that the burn holes right here were not present. Those were introduced in 1532. So let's look at this without those and without these scorch marks. Strong evidence that potentially the image of Edessa, which is recorded in the 4th, 5th centuries in Edessa, may have been the shroud before it was unfolded. So history has told us that we've gone, starting in Turin in 1578, we take it to Chambry in 1502, Lirey in 1353. Don't know exactly how it gets to Lirey, but we do record it in Constantinople up to through 1204, and then in Edessa to 944. We are tantalizingly close to Jerusalem, but we can't definitively make that connection. The truth is that the current historical record cannot definitively trace the shroud back to 1st century Jerusalem. Edessa is about as close as we can get. And that's really as far as the history part of our journey takes us. So let's look a little bit at the influence of the shroud in Christian art and iconography. Something to be aware of when we see the image or the story of the shroud in history kind of appears and disappears in those Middle Ages. There was a movement going on at that time called iconoclasm, which translates to image breaking. The thought here is that as more images of Christ, Mary, the saints, relics were appearing in those 6th and 7th centuries, there was a lot of question about their legitimacy, as you could understand. And really, people in the church, particularly in the Eastern church around Constantinople, started equating that with idolatry. You're worshiping the objects and not the God. So iconoclasm really took hold in the 8th and 9th centuries. It was started by the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, that's Leo down there. They justified it on the second commandment that you shall have no false gods before me. And really the point for us to remember is iconoclasts said it was impossible in icons to depict Christ's divinity. And the reason that matters for us is because if you potentially have a relic like the shroud with an image that maybe you can't explain, probably going to want to keep that hidden. So that may have a part in explaining why we don't see a lot of record in the shroud in that time in the historical record. We do, however, have some other clues. There's a document called the Hungarian Prey manuscript, which is, it's a collection of medieval manuscripts. The authoring has been dated to 1192 to 1195. Part of its significance is it's the first recorded history of the Hungarian language being written. And it was believed to have been authored in a monastery in northern Hungary, in Boldva, which coincidentally lies on the path if you draw a line from Lirey to Constantinople. It goes really close to that, really close to Boldva. It was discovered in 1770. It's currently housed in a museum in Hungary. It has a lot of documents, a lot of prayers, a lot of ceremonies. It also has some illustrations. And these two illustrations, they have some illustrations around the passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord. And these two I want to draw some attention to. So first of all, this one on top, which is the burial of Christ, we notice something that we talked about when we were first looking at the shroud. We see Christ is unclothed, just like the image in the shroud. And also we see one hand folded over the other and the absence of thumbs. Very peculiar aspect of the shroud that we notice here too. Then in the bottom one, we have the resurrection scene. So we have the ladies coming to anoint the body, the angel of the Lord saying he's not here and pointing to where he lay. And let's take a little bit closer look at that. A couple of really particular points to look at on the Hungarian Prey manuscript in this image. We're going to focus in on this area down here. So just to show you again, we have, some people say that's a lid of a coffin, some say it's a cloth. But if you look at this area and we go look at it in detail, there's two distinct points on this. One is, we talked about the unique weave of the shroud. It has a 3-in-1 herringbone weave, which is, I'm not a weaver, but 3 passes over and 1 pass under. You get this kind of zigzag pattern, and we see that here. And the other one, the other pattern, which you may or may not have noticed from before, that L-shaped pattern of holes matches up perfectly with the L-shaped burn pattern on the shroud. So what does this tell us? That potentially, maybe quite likely, the illustrator of the Hungarian Prey manuscript in 1192 to 1195 could have seen the shroud and painted what he or she saw. We don't know when these burn holes were introduced to the shroud. We do know the shroud was folded twice when it happened, because if you fold it in 4, those burn patterns line up. A lot of different stories about it, but this gives us some very strong evidence that that happened prior to 1192. And it's carried on through history. So this is just a further point. This is a painting of the shroud that hangs in a church in Belgium. Just the point of, it's a 1516 painting that we see that the burn holes are here, but the triangular shaped burn holes are not. So it just kind of dates those damage marks for us. One other thing on the iconography. Before the Edessa image reemerged, so we're talking the 1st through the 4th centuries in early Christianity, all of the icons that we see of Jesus more or less is portrayed as a Greco-Roman man. So we see, and this is for the 4th century mosaic, he has basically Roman hair, beardless, very kind of Roman-looking face. Look, he could have kind of walked right out of Rome himself. Once the image of Edessa shows up in history, everything changes in iconography of Jesus. Now, we see what, if you think back to your own past, most of those, if not all of the images of Christ, are now very long-faced. He has a beard. He has, look at this one in particular. So this is the Christ Pantocrator. This is one of the earliest known images from Byzantium of Christ. Remember, we talked about on the face, we talked about that to our right, as we're looking at the face, that eye seems very larger, much larger and swollen. We see that here. We see the cheek is larger. Now, with as perfect as the left side of that face as we see with the artist, do we think he or she just messed up on the other side? Or is there some reason that it was painted that way? We see it on coinage as well. So we see the long nose in all places. We see the long beard, the long hair. We see again in this, damage, but this eye looks larger than this eye on the in the Roman catacombs. So just to point out that once that image of Edessa appears in history, not only does all of the iconography of Christ change, it all bears remarkable resemblance to the shroud. And in particular, that Christ Pantocrator, there's been a study done on the face of the shroud, and there's some 60 or 70 points of congruence, which gives us very strong evidence that whoever painted that probably saw the shroud. So let's get into the science and the technology. So the story of science and technology and the study of the shroud really only begins in the late 19th century, so specifically 1898. 1898, Turin, Italy. We're celebrating the 400th anniversary of the Turin Cathedral. Remember, it was built in 1498. This is actually a flyer publicizing the event. They're going to display the shroud as part of the celebration. And they're talking about commissioning a couple of paintings of the shroud. And for the first time ever, an amateur photographer named Secondo Pia asks to photograph the shroud, permission to photograph it, which he's granted. And it's the first time in history. So at this point, photography is really in its technological infancy. And so he's going to go, and that's Secondo Pia with his camera, the old Bellows cameras, the glass plate negative, and he photographs the shroud. He brings it into his developing room, and he's developing the glass plate in the solution, and by his own words, as the image formed on the glass plate, he almost dropped it and broke it. Because what Secondo Pia sees shakes him to his core. This is amazing. This is a human image that's what's supposed to be a negative. So I think we're probably all old enough to remember the old 35 millimeter film negatives. If you looked at the negatives that you would get from Photomat, if I'm really going to date myself, you'd look at those negatives, you couldn't really tell who was who, what was what, it just everything was kind of reversed until you look at the actual image. Here we see the reverse. So now the photographic negative is showing us a positive image. How can this be? Don't know. If that's not enough, when he photographs the entire shroud, something both unbelievable and unimaginable surfaces. We can see now a fully human form in incredible detail. So we see the long face, all the white spots here are on the surface of the shroud. So we see what appears to be concentrations of something around the head, all over the body as we mentioned, but we also see the body, and we see as if we're seeing in 3 dimensions. So we see depth to this image. We can see darks, we can see lights, we can see just kind of the normal shading that we would expect to see, but it's in the image on the cloth itself. No one can see this with the naked eye. This opens up a whole new world. Now, just as Pierre Darcy calls the shroud a forgery in the 1300s to try to stop its propagation, similar derision is brought on Secondo Pia. He's almost instantly accused of having forged his photograph, forged the images. He's derided. It's not until 1931 when another gentleman Henri, photographs the shroud in 1931, an event that Secondo Pia is present for, that he's finally validated because Henri's images and even further definition show what Secondo Pia's images show. That's really the extent of scientific study on it until 1976. There's an analog instrument called the VP8 Image Analyzer, and it analyzes images to really, the best way to explain it is what I've got up there. It measures lights and darks in an image and turns it into vertical relief. So some application here in NASA photographing the moon, if you can take a moon photograph and you can process it, you could get depth of craters, etc. So that's some of those applications. But it creates a brightness map of the image. Now, if you put a normal photograph in the VP8, you won't get what you think you're going to get. It's going to be distorted. So they actually did it. So here's George Clooney in the VP8 image analyzer, and his face is a mess. So any of the guys like me, if you feel intimidated by George Clooney, just know he looks like a mess in the VP8. And the reason for that is you can play tricks with lighting when you're taking a photograph. It's not distance information, right? So it gets muddied. Now, in 1976, 2 physicians, Dr. John Jackson and Dr. Eric Jumper, are using the VP8 to actually analyze X-rays. So we've all seen an X-ray before. If you look at it, you can kind of see depth to to your hand or whatever you have x-rayed, and potentially, if you look at Secundo Pia's photographs, it kind of looks like an x-ray. They put a positive image of the shroud, just a photograph of the shroud face, into the VP8, and this is what they find. They discover that the shroud image itself contains 3D encoded information. It contains distance information in the image on the shroud. No other photograph in the world has this reaction, or has this effect, or this result, I should say, in the VP8. Only photographs of the shroud. So we see a photograph of the full body of the shroud here, and you see those burn marks showing up. It's the VP8's trying to process that as distance information, but it clearly picks up distance measurements of the man in the shroud. And then this is when you turn the gain up and down on the VP8, the shroud, the face pops right out of the image. So the doctors both were at the Air Force Academy, and they created a model of the full body of the shroud. They took slices and they cut it by cardboard, and they created a full body cardboard cutout in slices of the man in the shroud that's still at the Air Force Academy Chapel. Well, this finding really wakes up the scientific world into the possibilities. And so the doctors, Jackson and Jumper, get a bunch of other scientists in America, and they form a group that requests and receives permission to go and study the shroud directly. It's 1978. It's called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP. It's in October of 1978. There's 26 team members that the doctors are leading, all different scientific disciplines. They're given unprecedented access to the shroud. It's brought out of its case, it's mounted to a table, it's brought into the palace, which is behind there, behind the chapel, and they get 120 continuous hours, 5 days, 24 hours a day. They actually sleep in shifts so that at every minute they're maximizing the use of the time. Somebody is studying that shroud every minute for 120 hours. Here's the full test plan. I couldn't even explain to you all of those different tests, but all different kinds of disciplines, lots of photography. They have a couple I'll highlight. Raking light photographs, which is photographing at an angle. Kind of if you have shadows and shades at an angle. They light it from the front, they do backlit photographs. They put the light behind the shroud and take photographs. Microphotographs, microscopies, all sorts of studies, X-ray, radiography, etc. And they find some very, very interesting findings, a couple that we'll touch. Let's touch a little bit on the physical evidence. They do study the weave of the shroud. They find, as we said, it's a 3-in-1 herringbone weave, and as they study it in detail, they find it's extremely rare. And what we do know is there are no other known examples in linen from the 1st century or the early history from the 1st century onward. We see it in silk and we see it in wool, the higher priced linen or higher priced cloths of the time, but not in linen. And we also know, since we know that the shroud was in France and accused of forgery, there are no known examples in France of a herringbone twill up through the 14th century, which is when it appeared in Leray, France. So if anyone is going to forge it, why would they go to the extent of creating an elaborate 3-in-1 herringbone weave when you're going to try to maximize your profit if you're forging it? And this is kind of what a herringbone weave looks like. So that's an example of a 3-in-1 there. That's a regular weave. So it's a very unique weave. They also find soil samples on the cloth. They're doing a spectrograph of the whole cloth. They get down to the feet and the spectrograph jumps off the scale. And they find dirt, particularly on the soles of the feet and then also on the knees, concentrations. Emblematic of somebody that may have been walking in sandals or bare feet and possibly on their knees or fallen. But that's where they see the concentrations. They do study of that dirt and they find that is limestone, and particular kind of limestone called travertine aragonite. Can you guess where travertine aragonite is typically found? It's typically found in caves in Palestine. It's very emblematic of the area in Palestine and around Jerusalem. The man that was in the shroud walked in Jerusalem or in the Palestine area. Then we go to the blood evidence. And it's shocking to say the least when it's highlighted. What do we see? We see crucifixion marks. That's the top of the feet. That's the bottom of the feet. They actually find 2 crucifixion marks in the right foot. So they surmise that the man in the shroud was nailed to a cross, one nail going through the right foot through his heel, and then a second one, they put the left foot over the right foot and nailed through the arches. So actually 2 nails. They find crucifixion mark blood concentration on the wrist. This is consistent with historically how crucifixions were conducted by the Romans, because if you put nails in the hands and you suspend a body weight on the cross, the structure of the hand is not sufficient to hold up the body. It would tear out. And so you crucify through the wrist. Also interesting, when that's done, you damage what's called the median nerve in the wrist. A side effect of damage of the median nerve is it pulls your thumb over. So if the man in the shroud was crucified through the wrists, likely that those thumbs are pulled over and they don't appear on the shroud. We have a concentration of blood around the head. Around the head here. We have a deep concentration of blood. They find a 4-centimeter wound between the 5th and 6th ribs on the right side. And all of these scourge marks. The scourge marks, they determined that they're scourge marks and made by a Roman flagrum, which is usually a 2 or 3 tether short whip with metal barbells wrapped in the end. They determined that the man in the shroud was scourged either by one person switching sides from left to right, or by 2 people, both all in the back, the entire back of the body, and basically all the front. Over 120 scourge marks found on the body. The concentrations on the wounds on the scalp are consistent with puncture wounds, as from a crown of thorns. There's severe bruising both on the knees and on the back and the shoulder blade. So they find bruising around here as well, heavy bruising across the back, as if someone would be bruised carrying a cross piece from a cross, which is a lot what most of the Romans did. They didn't normally carry a full cross. They would have an upright piece at the place of crucifixion, and they would normally tie the cross beam across the back of the person to be crucified, and they would carry it that way. What they find in the shroud is consistent with that. They also find it's not just blood. It is human blood, but it's also mixed with serum fluid, which is consistent with somebody who's undergone severe physical stress. So not only blood, but serum, particularly around the chest wound. They find pleural fluid, which is from the lungs. Also, it's blood type AB, which is a rare blood type, but is very common among Palestinians, people living in Palestine natively. And they also find interesting, the blood stains have well-defined edges, no burrs, no smears. So it can be assumed that the corpse that deposited the blood stains on the shroud was not removed from the sheet. Let me say that again. The corpse that placed the blood stains on the shroud was not physically removed from the sheet. If they had been, there would be smears, and edges. They were not. So what are the conclusions of Stirp? Ultimately, they released their conclusions 3 years later. We'll go through some of them. Lots of words here, I'm just going to highlight some. They found that there were no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains found on the shroud. Studies preclude the possibility of paint being used as a method for creating the image. In fact, when they did the backlit photography, when you light the shroud from the back, you see all the blood stains, you see the water stains. Some of those water stains we know are from fighting the fire in 1532. But the image disappears when it's lit from the back. So it's not painted on. It literally disappears, and you just see the blood stains and the water stains. The image has unique 3-dimensional information encoded on it, which we talked about from the VP8 analysis. No evidence of any biochemicals known to be produced by the body in life or in death. Why is that important? That means the body laying in the shroud was not decaying. They surmised that the body in the shroud spent a maximum of 40 hours in contact with the shroud. 40 hours. Maximum. It's clear that there has been direct contact of the shroud with a body. While this type of contact might explain some of the features of the torso, it is totally incapable of explaining the image of the face with the high resolution that we see. At the present, this type of solution does not appear to be obtainable by the best efforts of the members of the Shroud team. Experiments in physics and chemistry with old linen have failed to reproduce adequately the phenomenon presented by the Shroud of Turin. The image was produced by something which resulted in oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the polysaccharide structure of the microfibrils of the linen itself. What were those words? It was prematurely or rapidly aged. The image on the shroud is created by rapid aging of that portion of the cloth. That's what that's saying. There are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery. That's as of 1981. So we're left with, we understand the physical aspects of the shroud. We can explain the blood. We can explain the pleural fluid in human form. But how was that image created? How was it created? Well, let's look at a couple of characteristics. It's present only on the uppermost surface of the fibrils, a few microns thick. It does not penetrate all the way through the cloth. It's only on the very, very upper surface of those top fibers. Those fibers are 10 to 20 times thinner than a human hair. There's no outlines, there's no brush strokes. If you were to take a razor blade and just scrape across any of those darkened fibers, the image would disappear there. The image itself has X-ray properties, meaning distance. It's in the face. You can see part of the sinuses, part of the teeth are visible, they found. In the hands, the long hands, they look kind of long and bony. The metacarpals, the bones in the hands, are actually visible in the image. The image shows the whole body, but not all areas of the cloth came into contact with the whole body. So how is the image of the entire body placed on the cloth, even though it wasn't a contact image because it wasn't all in contact with the body? There's no directionality to the image. It's what's called collimated. And yes, I had to do my homework on this. What's collimated? It means straight, parallel. The image on the front and back was created in a straight line, not radiated out from the body. So any kind of chemical process or something emanating in all directions from the body? No. It was created front and back in a straight line. It is anatomically correct, 5'11", about 175-pound human male. There are imageless areas. So the blood spots on the shroud, they found that there is no image underneath the blood spots. So what does that mean? That means the blood has to be on the shroud before the image is created. And finally, the image on the shroud varies inversely with the cloth to body distance. So what does that mean? That means, again, further distance information. So when you pixelate that image, the raw image on the shroud, it carries a relationship of how far away that part of the body was from the shroud in a straight line when the image was created. So any way today to make that image through a contact, let alone in 1353 in Lorraine, France, can't be explained. Let's jump ahead to The Real Face of Jesus, a documentary done in 2011 by a gentleman named Ray Downing. He's an Emmy Award-winning 3D graphic artist. He spent over a year analyzing the shroud images electronically and found, as we talked about with the VP8 image analyzer, there's 3D encoded information in the shroud, so he processed it as he would any other 3D animation that he does. And what he found, and he concluded, was that the image was formed by light, kind of like a Xerox was how he said. But instead of in a Xerox where if you put your hand there and the light bar goes across and shoots the light, this was light emanating from the body. From the body. He created a rendering of the image from the 3D information, created what he sees as the face of Jesus. And this is what came out of the 3D image on the shroud, was this face. Kind of the most recent piece of science, the Italian ENEA Technology Agency did a 5-year study on the shroud to determine specifically how could the image have been formed. This is pretty much the latest information. Here's some of their findings. The shroud has some features that we are not yet able to reproduce. For example, the gradient of the image caused by different concentration of yellow-colored fibrils that alternate with unstained fibrils. So they can't recreate it even today, that gradient. What they did find, how was it created? The best they can tell is by something called VUV, or vacuum ultraviolet radiation. What is that? We all know sunburns. Ultraviolet, UV, UVA, UVB, vacuum ultraviolet is ultraviolet radiation that has to have a vacuum to exist. They say it should be noted that the total power of VUV required to instantly color the surface of a linen that corresponds to the size of a human image on the shroud is equal to 34,000 billion watts of energy. That's 34 trillion watts of vacuum ultraviolet energy would be necessary to recreate that image. But without the corresponding heat, which any expert and any of us could surmise would vaporize that cloth in an instant. It would have to be in a billionth of a second instant of that much energy is what the latest technology tells us would be necessary to create the image on the shroud. They note also, it's impractical obviously, to do with a single laser excimer since this power cannot even be reproduced by any vacuum ultraviolet light source built to date. So we can't even build a vacuum ultraviolet laser to harness that much power, let alone without the heat. And yet, that's what 5 years of studies have told them. That's what would be necessary to create the image on the shroud. And most likely, how it was formed. Their final conclusion, we're not at the conclusion, but we are composing pieces of a fascinating and complex scientific puzzle. Amen. So when I approach this, I looked at it as a little bit of Indiana Jones adventure. I didn't mention at the beginning, but also a little bit of court case. We talked about having a doubting Thomas mindset. So a couple of objections you may have, we'll cover them briefly. You may say, and you'd be right, you can't trace the shroud back to Jerusalem. Well, not by history alone, but there's a little bit in the botanical evidence. I didn't talk about this in the scientific study before. The botanical evidence on the shroud. A couple of quick highlights. In 1973, a Swiss botanist named Max Free had collected a lot of pollen samples, about 50, 60 from the shroud, and said the most frequent pollen on the shroud is identical to the most frequent pollen in sediments of the Lake of Gennesaret sedimentary layers from 2,000 years ago. I had to look it up. Anybody know what the Lake of Gennesaret is? It's the Sea of Galilee. So the concentration of pollens on the shroud most closely match the concentrations of pollens found in the sediment from the Sea of Galilee dating back 2,000 years ago. In 1999, the Hebrew University botanist Evian Deneen did some study on Free's samples and some further studies and confirmed another thing that Free had found, which was the presence of a particular pollen called Gundelia tourneforti. High density of pollens, it's a thistle. That's a picture of it on the upper right. That's what Gundelia tourneforti looks like, and that's its pollen. An image of the plant could actually be seen near the image of the man's shoulder on the shroud, which may have been the source of the crown of thorns. And Deneen said the combination of flowers can be found in only one region of the world, this and other pollens found. The evidence clearly points to a floral grouping from the area surrounding Jerusalem. The images of the Capparis argyropeda flowers, which display a distinctive pattern during daylight hours, have also been seen on the shroud. The process of buds opening ceases when the flowers are picked and no water is supplied. The images of these flowers on the shroud suggest that they were picked in the Judean desert or the Dead Sea Valley between 3 and 4 p.m. on the day that they were placed on the shroud. You might say the Catholic Church doesn't say the shroud is authentic, and you would be right. They take no official position on it. They do, however, throughout history we've seen, encourage veneration of it. In fact, in January 21st, 2015, here's Pope Francis himself venerating the shroud. So the Catholic Church will not tell you what to believe about it, but they encourage veneration of it. You might say to me, you have no direct corroborating evidence, counselor. You have one artifact. Let me introduce you briefly to the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is another cloth that lies in Oviedo, Spain, in northern Spain in the mountains. It's a piece of cloth measuring about 3 feet by 2 feet, 33 by 21 inches. It's known to have been in Palestine until 614. Jerusalem was attacked by the Persians. The Sudarium was evacuated to Alexandria, Egypt, and then made its way across ahead of the advancing Moors, all the way across North Africa, across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain, and eventually arrives in Oviedo, documented in the mountains of Oviedo for safekeeping in 718 AD. This is the Sudarium of Oviedo. It's a bloody mess. There is no image on the cloth like there is on the shroud, but we do see heavy concentration of blood. This has actually been folded 4 times, so maybe a little tough to see, but this is the first fold, and then this is the second, and then there's the third and the fourth. But looking at this blood on here, or the stains on here, they did scientific studies and found that a few things. It covered the face of a man who died upright, with his head tilted forward at 70 degrees and 20 degrees to the right. The stains on it are 1 part blood and 7 or 6 parts pleural fluid, lung fluid, which if somebody dies with their lungs full of fluid, which by the way is how a person dies in crucifixion, is they actually asphyxiate because they can't breathe. When you're hanging on the cross, your diaphragm moves up and down normally, but when you're stretched out, you cannot breathe. So the person on the cross would typically have to raise themselves up on their feet to breathe, eventually run out of energy, and you're hanging, you're not breathing, your lungs fill with fluid. So it's 1 part blood, 6 parts pleural fluid. Pollen there is from Oviedo, Spain, Toledo, North Africa, all the way to Jerusalem. The pollen evidence on the shroud, on the Sudarium tells us of its travel just the way that history does. There's also residue of myrrh and aloe on the Sudarium. Coincidentally with the shroud, both are blood type AB. The length of the nose, which they've been able to surmise of the person in the Sudarium, was 8 centimeters, just the same as the shroud. There's a small stain on the right side of the man's mouth. It's not visible on the shroud by the naked eye, but scientists have confirmed its presence with the VP8 image analyzer, a blood stain on the mouth, and it's present on the Sudarium. And there's thorn wounds on the nape of the neck of the man whose face was covered in the Sudarium, and that matches perfectly with thorn wounds on the nape of the neck of the man in the shroud. And finally, the image overlay, when you overlay the Sudarium on top of the shroud, the face of the shroud, it shows over 120 points of congruence between the Sudarium and the shroud, 70 on the front, 50 on the back. Unequivocally, beyond any shadow of a doubt, beyond what would be required in a court of law, the Sudarium of Oviedo has been scientifically proven to have covered the head and the face of the same man who was in the shroud. And there's your corroborating evidence. So what does that leave us with? We've taken a path through history with this cloth. We've traced it back all the way across Europe, all the way across the Middle East. We've looked at it from science, we looked at it from technology, we've looked at the image, we looked at the blood stains, we looked at the water stains, the fire damage. What does this leave us with? What are we looking at as an image of a crucified man, scourged man? Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. They took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called Place of a Skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, and there they crucified him. When they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs, But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. They took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. The other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying, and the napkin which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. When we started this journey, I asked you to adopt a doubting Thomas mindset. And we've asked a lot of different questions. We've asked who, what, when, where, and how. And we've answered all of them. But we haven't asked the most important question. Why? Why has this relic, this icon, why has this cloth existed for 2,000 years? Why has it survived floods, fires, wars, travel halfway across the world? Why does it contain this image? Why? You know, we've come to the point now where in most trial presentations, the presenter will tell you, well, I'm going to give you all the evidence, but I'm going to let you decide. And I will, but I'm going to tell you what I believe. What did Jesus do for Thomas? Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Why? For you. For me. For each one of us that want desperately to believe and struggle and need that little bit of evidence, that's why. That's why it's survived so long, and that's why it's where it is today. And that's why you're here. We talk about taking a leap of faith. My hope tonight is that our time together has turned that leap of faith for you into maybe just a small step. Thank you very much.